My mother-in-law opened the front door, looked at me standing on her porch with a suitcase and a positive pregnancy test in my hand, and said, "I always knew you'd be a problem." Then she stepped aside so her son could tell me to leave. That was 9 years ago. Last Tuesday, my assistant knocked on my office door and said there was a woman downstairs who didn't have an appointment but claimed it was a family matter. She gave me the name. I sat very still for a moment, looking out the window at downtown Nashville, at the city I had built a life in from nothing. Then I told my assistant to send her up, and I made her wait 22 minutes first. My name is Celeste Harmon. I was 27 years old when my marriage ended, my pregnancy ended, and my sense of self ended, all inside the same brutal season. What grew back from that wreckage looked nothing like what came before, and I think that was the point. Let me take you back, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, about an hour outside Nashville, in a house that was always just a little too quiet. My father worked long shifts at a distribution warehouse and came home tired in a way that went beyond his body. My mother cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and never once complained about it, which I used to think meant she was at peace with her life. I understand now that she was just too exhausted to articulate the alternatives. We weren't poor in a way that made headlines. We were poor in the way that meant the heat got turned down to 62 degrees in January, and we all wore extra socks and didn't discuss it. Poor in the way that meant I got a full academic scholarship to Middle Tennessee State, and my parents cried at the kitchen table when the letter came, not because they were proud, which they were, but because they were so profoundly relieved. I studied accounting because it was practical, because numbers made sense to me in a way that people sometimes didn't. I was good at seeing where things were going wrong before they went wrong, which, looking back, is a skill I apparently reserved entirely for other people's finances. I met my husband at a friend's birthday party when I was 24. He was 30, confident in that easy way that comes from never having had to hustle for anything, and he laughed at something I said before I even finished saying it. 3 years later, we were married in a ceremony his mother largely orchestrated, and I largely smiled through. I should tell you about my mother-in-law, because she is the axis around which this whole story turns. Her name is Sandra, and she is the kind of woman who phrases every criticism as a compliment. She would say things like, "That dress is so brave on you," or, "I love that you're not afraid to speak your mind even when you probably shouldn't." She had opinions about my cooking, my job, my posture, the way I loaded the dishwasher. She delivered all of them with this particular smile, warm on the surface and absolutely nothing underneath. My husband was her only child. She had raised him alone after his father left when he was 6, and she had made him the center of her entire universe in a way that left no room for anyone else to matter as much. I understood that, intellectually. I even respected it in the beginning. What I didn't understand was that marrying him meant I was not joining a family. I was auditioning for a role I had already been disqualified from. She never said she didn't like me. She was too smart for that. She just consistently, quietly, skillfully made me feel like I was a guest in my own marriage. My husband let her. That was the part I kept trying to explain away for 3 years. He wasn't cruel on his own. He was just weak in the specific way that some people are weak, the kind where they've never had to choose between their comfort and someone else's dignity because someone else always absorbed the discomfort for them. His mother had spent 30 years making sure life was soft for him. I had inherited that job without understanding the terms. When I got pregnant, I was terrified and hopeful in equal measure. We hadn't been trying exactly, but we hadn't not been trying either. My husband seemed happy. He talked about nursery colors. He downloaded one of those week-by-week apps and read me the fruit comparisons every Sunday morning. Week 8, raspberry. Week 10, kumquat. I let myself believe we were building something real. I was 11 weeks along when things started going sideways. Not with the pregnancy. That was fine, healthy, growing on schedule. What went sideways was my husband. He started working late in a way that felt performative, texting with his phone face down, coming to bed after I was asleep. I told myself it was stress. A big project at work, something explainable. I was very good at finding explanations. I found out the real explanation on a Wednesday afternoon in October. I left work early because I had a prenatal appointment and my husband was supposed to meet me there. He didn't show. I called twice, no answer. I drove to his office to surprise him, to maybe catch him frazzled and apologetic, to have the kind of fight that ends with someone saying, "I'm sorry, I've just been overwhelmed." He wasn't at his office. His assistant, a young woman named, well, I'll just say she had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable, told me he'd left 2 hours ago for a personal appointment. I drove home. He was there. So was someone else. I won't give you the graphic version because honestly, I've spent enough of my life living in that moment without making you sit in it too. What matters is what happened after. What matters is that he looked at me, standing in the doorway of the house we shared, carrying his child, and the first thing he said was, "I can't explain." He couldn't, as it turned out. Or maybe he could and just chose not to, which is its own kind of answer. I spent that night at a hotel 3 miles away, staring at the ceiling, one hand on my stomach, having a conversation with my baby that went something like, "I don't know what we're doing yet, but I promise we're going to figure it out." I ordered room service for the first time in my adult life. A grilled cheese and a bowl of tomato soup, and I sat on the bathroom floor and ate it because the bed felt too big and the chair felt too exposed, and the bathroom floor felt strangely like the most honest place in the building. The next morning, I went back to get my things. My husband was there. So was his mother. I don't know who called her. Maybe he did. Maybe she just sensed a crisis the way she always seemed to sense opportunities to be necessary. She was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee from my favorite mug, calm as a weather system that had already decided what it was going to do. She didn't yell. I want to be clear about that, because yelling would have been easier. Yelling would have at least acknowledged that something significant was happening. Instead, she spoke in this measured, almost gentle tone, like she was explaining a policy change to someone who probably wouldn't understand it anyway. She said my husband had made some mistakes, but that men sometimes did, and that what mattered now was the family. She said she hoped I would think carefully before making any decisions that couldn't be undone. She said, and I am going to remember this exact phrasing for the rest of my life, "You were never quite the right fit, Celeste. I think somewhere you always knew that." I looked at my husband. He was looking at the floor. I asked him directly, "Do you want me to leave?" He said he thought maybe some space would help everyone think clearly. Some space. 9 years of clearly, and I still hear those words sometimes, late at night in the specific register of a man too cowardly to finish a sentence he started. I took my suitcase. I had $2,300 in a personal checking account and one credit card with a $4,000 limit that I had never used because I'd always been careful. I drove to my parents' house in Clarksville and sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by old debate team trophies and a poster of a mountain range I'd never visited, and I cried until something inside me went quiet. My mother sat with me. She didn't say much. She brought me tea and crackers because I'd been nauseous all morning, and she sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed my back the way she had when I was little. I cannot tell you how much that mattered. Sometimes the people who don't have the words have the hands that say everything anyway. The miscarriage happened 3 weeks later. I'm not going to spend a long time here because I am still, 9 years later, not able to spend a long time here. What I will say is that I was alone in my parents' bathroom at 2 in the morning when I understood what was happening, and I sat on that cold tile floor, and I grieved something that had been both a life and a plan and a reason. And when morning came, I was different in a way I couldn't name yet. My husband called when he found out. He sounded sorry. I believe he was, in the way people are sorry about weather, genuinely regretful that it happened, not remotely responsible for the conditions that caused it. His mother sent a card. It said she was sorry for my loss and that she hoped I would heal quickly. She signed it with both their last names. She did not include her son's handwriting. I did not respond. Here's what I had, taking inventory in my parents' guest room. A CPA license, 4 years of experience at a mid-size accounting firm, $2,300 in checking, one maxed credit card I'd used to cover my first month's expenses, a suitcase, and approximately zero plan. Here is what I built from that list. I moved to Nashville because I knew the market, knew some people, and because Clarksville felt like a place where I could too easily disappear into a smaller version of my life. I found a studio apartment in East Nashville for $875 a month, which was everything I could afford and slightly more. The building had a broken elevator and a neighbor who played acoustic guitar at 11 p.m. on weeknights, and I grew to love both of them fiercely. I got a job at a regional accounting firm within 3 weeks of moving. It wasn't glamorous, mostly small business bookkeeping, quarterly filings, the kind of work that makes people's eyes glaze when you describe it at parties. I was good at it in a way that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with precision. I showed up early, I stayed late. I learned the patterns behind the numbers, which is different from just reading the numbers. The same way learning to read a room is different from just hearing what's said in it. My direct supervisor was a woman named Harriet, 61 years old, twice divorced. With reading glasses, she kept losing on top of her head and an absolutely zero-tolerance policy for excuses. She was the toughest professional environment I had ever encountered and exactly what I needed. Harriet had started her own bookkeeping business out of her spare bedroom in 1987 with 2 clients and a calculator her first husband had given her as a wedding gift, which she kept as a joke and a reminder. She had built it into something real, sold it, moved into corporate, and spent the last decade teaching younger accountants to think like owners instead of employees. She called me into her office 4 months after I started and asked me what I was actually trying to do with my career. I told her I wanted to stop feeling like I was surviving and start feeling like I was building something. She nodded once, like that was the right answer, and started giving me more responsibility than my job title called for. I should tell you about the thing that shifted everything, because it wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive in a lightning bolt. It arrived in a spreadsheet. One of our clients was a small property management company that was hemorrhaging money in ways their previous accountant had missed entirely. I spent a weekend going through 18 months of records and found 11 separate places where the system was leaking. I wrote a 40-page report. I recommended structural changes that saved them $340,000 in the first year. The owner of that company, a man in his 60s named Walter, called Harriet to say that whoever had done his audit had just changed the trajectory of his business. Harriet gave him my direct line. Walter became my first independent client. Then he referred me to 2 other property managers. Those 2 referred me to 3 more. I started taking on work outside of my regular hours, then more work, then a realization that I was running a second business out of my apartment kitchen at 10 p.m., and maybe I should acknowledge that for what it was. I got my CPA certification upgraded. I studied for and passed the Certified Fraud Examiner exam because I had discovered in going through Walter's books that I had a particular talent for finding the things people tried to hide. Numbers, it turns out, always tell the truth eventually. You just have to know where to look and be patient enough to look there. Harriet retired when I was 31. She called me into her office for the last time, handed me a bottle of Maker's Mark, and told me I'd been the best thing to happen to that firm in a decade and that I was an idiot if I didn't go out on my own within the year. I went out on my own within a year. Harmon Financial Consulting, named for me and no one else, registered in the state of Tennessee on a Tuesday morning while I sat at my kitchen table in the apartment I had long since upgraded from the East Nashville studio. I had 17 clients ready to follow me on day 1. By the end of the first year, I had 34. The work I became known for was forensic accounting, going into businesses where something felt wrong and finding out exactly how wrong and exactly where. I was good at it because I understood from personal experience how people justified the things they hid, how they convinced themselves that the small deceptions were harmless, how they told themselves nobody would notice if they just moved this number over here, adjusted that figure over there. I noticed. I built a team. I moved into a proper office on the 4th floor of a building with a view of the Cumberland River. I started being quoted in Nashville Business Journal articles about fraud prevention and financial oversight. I spoke at 2 conferences. I quietly, deliberately, kept my personal life off the internet and out of the press, because I had learned the value of being underestimated. My personal life for those years was also quietly being rebuilt in ways that felt more solid than the first version. I did not date for 2 years after my marriage ended. Not because I was broken, though I was somewhat, but because I needed to understand myself as a standalone entity before I brought anyone else into the equation. I had spent 3 years being slowly diminished by my mother-in-law's assessments and my husband's passivity, and I needed to locate the parts of me that predated all of that. When I finally started dating again, I was 30 years old and had a very clear sense of what I would and would not accept. I went on dates that went nowhere and felt fine about it. I met someone who seemed great for 4 months and then revealed himself to be emotionally unavailable in a way that was familiar and therefore easy to walk away from. Then I met Jonah. He was a civil engineer, 34 years old, with a son from a previous relationship, and he was the least performative person I had ever encountered. No grand gestures, no love bombing. He showed up consistently and on time and said what he meant, which sounds like a very low bar until you've spent years with people who couldn't clear it. I told him on our 3rd date about the miscarriage, which is maybe an unusual thing to do on a 3rd date, but I had decided that I was not going to invest in something I'd have to hide parts of myself from. He listened without trying to fix anything. He said he was sorry. Then he asked if I wanted to talk more about it or move on and let me make the choice. I thought about it for a moment and said I'd like to move on for now and maybe come back to it later. He said that sounded good. Then we talked about something else entirely, and at the end of the night when he walked me to my car, he said he'd had a really good time and he hoped we'd do this again. I did not call my husband's number that night, but I'm aware of a parallel. Jonah and I took things slowly by design, both of us. He introduced me to his son, a 7-year-old named Carter, after several months. Carter was serious and shy and obsessed with marine biology in the way only certain children can be obsessed with things, with an almost professional intensity. I asked him questions about anglerfish and he responded with 15 minutes of information that I retained better than I expected. We got along fine and then better than fine, and then eventually Carter started saving interesting ocean facts to tell me specifically, which I decided was one of the best things that had ever happened to me. I was doing well. I was building well. I had a business that ran on my reputation, a home that belonged to me, a relationship that felt honest, and a Saturday morning routine that involved good coffee and no apologies. I didn't think about my ex-husband or his mother with any frequency. They had become what old wounds sometimes become, not raw, not forgotten, just not particularly relevant. Ridgewood had its Ridgewood. Nashville had its Nashville. And then she showed up. My assistant told me a woman was downstairs claiming a family matter. The name my assistant gave me was Sandra's, my mother-in-law's. I suppose my former mother-in-law's, though that prefix still feels strange, like calling a scar a former injury. I told my assistant to send her up. Then I finished the paragraph I was reading in the risk assessment on my desk, refilled my coffee, made 2 notes in the margin of a report, and let 22 minutes pass before I walked out to meet her. She looked older than I expected, which is a silly thing to say. It had been 9 years, of course she did, but somehow I had preserved her in my memory at peak authority, the version of her who sat at my kitchen table with her son's last name like a shield. The woman in my waiting room was smaller. She held her purse in both hands. She was wearing a blazer that had been expensive once. She smiled when she saw me. The same smile, warm surface, nothing underneath. 9 years, and she was still running the same program. I didn't smile back. I said hello and led her to the small conference room, the one I use for intake meetings with new clients, which is comfortable but not impressive. Not my main office with the river view. She sat down. She told me I looked well. She said she'd heard good things about what I'd built. She said she'd always known I had real potential. I had always known I had real potential. I let her talk for a while because I was curious how long it would take her to get to the point. It took 11 minutes. The point was this. My ex-husband had made some business decisions, she said, that hadn't worked out the way he'd hoped. He had started a company a few years ago, a home renovation contracting business, and some of his partners had made choices he hadn't known about. And now there was an IRS audit and some debt. And the short version was that he needed the kind of help that someone with my specific expertise could provide. She said he was too proud to come himself. She said she had always respected me, even when things were complicated, and she hoped that respect was mutual. She said family was family, even when the paperwork changed. I thought about the hotel bathroom floor and the grilled cheese I ate sitting against the bathtub. I thought about the card she sent when I lost the baby, both their names signed in her handwriting. I thought about the phrase, "You were never quite the right fit." I thought about the conference room I'd put her in instead of my office. I asked her to tell me specifically what kind of trouble he was in. She gave me a vague outline, more vague than someone who actually wanted help would give. She was, I realized, still auditioning. Still performing the version of humility that stopped short of actually being humble. When she finished, I spoke clearly and without heat, because heat would have given her something to work with. I told her that I was a forensic accountant, that what I did, professionally and specifically, was find the things people tried to hide inside their finances, that if her son had partners who made choices he didn't know about, I would need full access to everything, and what I found would not stay quiet if it crossed legal lines. I asked her if she understood that. She said, of course, that wasn't a concern. I said that wasn't actually my point. My point was that this wasn't a favor I could extend. Forensic accounting wasn't a kindness you could do for family. It was a professional service that required the kind of objectivity I was categorically unable to provide when the subject was someone who had looked at me in a doorway 9 years ago and suggested that space might help. She started to say something. I continued. I told her I didn't harbor resentment toward her son. That was the truth. I had stopped carrying it somewhere around year 4 when I realized that the weight of it was costing me more than he deserved. But not harboring resentment was not the same as being available. Not being angry was not the same as being willing. Then I looked at her directly, the way I had wanted to look at her for 9 years, not with rage, just with clarity, and I said the thing I had never gotten to say at my kitchen table with her coffee cup sitting on my counter. I told her that she had sat in my home and told me I was never the right fit, that she had been present when her son asked me to leave and she had said nothing to soften it, and nothing to stop it, that she had signed a condolence card with her last name, the one I no longer carried, as though reminding me was a kindness, and that I had, in the years since, built something that required exactly none of her approval to stand. She was quiet. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked like she didn't have a prepared response. I told her I hoped her son found a good attorney and a competent accountant. I even wrote down 2 names, colleagues of mine, good professionals, and slid the paper across the table. Because I'm not cruel. I just know the difference between charity and self-abandonment. Then I stood up, which ended the meeting. She picked up her purse. She stood more slowly than she had sat down. At the door, she turned and said that she supposed she deserved that. I told her I wasn't trying to give her what she deserved. I just wasn't in the business of giving her what she wanted. I walked her to the elevator and pressed the button and waited until the doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. I stood in the hallway for a moment, watching the number above the elevator count down to the lobby. Then I walked back to my office, the one with the river view, and I sat down at my desk, and for a very long time I just looked out the window at the water. I was thinking about my mother, and the tea she brought me, and the way she sat on the edge of my childhood bed without saying anything, and how that turned out to be exactly the right thing. I was thinking about Harriet, handing me a bottle of bourbon and telling me I'd be an idiot not to go out on my own, and how that also turned out to be exactly the right thing. I was thinking about Carter and his anglerfish facts, and Jonah showing up consistently and without performance, and the office I sat in with my name on the door and on every contract and on the wall in the lobby downstairs. I was thinking about a bathroom floor in a Holiday Inn in October and a bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich and a conversation I had with someone who hadn't been born yet, where I promised we would figure it out. We did. I did. One of us made it all the way to here. That has to be enough. And some days, most days now, it more than is. Before I get back to the rest of it, I just want to say, if any part of this story feels familiar to you, if you know what it is to be told you were never quite the right fit by someone who is supposed to be choosing you, leave me a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. You are not alone in this, and you were never the problem. Thank you for being here with me. And now, back to building. I've thought a lot about what Sandra expected to happen when she walked into my building that day. I think she expected the version of me she remembered, the one who swallowed things, who looked to her son for confirmation, who needed the marriage to work badly enough to absorb almost anything. She had known that version of me for 3 years. She had, in some ways, helped create her. What she found instead was a woman who had built something real on the foundation of everything Sandra's household had taken from her. And I don't think she knew what to do with that. Here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect, not in any mystical sense, just in the plain human sense that the things we do accumulate. Sandra spent years making small, precise decisions to diminish me. She chose words carefully. She framed her criticisms as observations. She stayed quiet when her son needed someone to tell him the truth. Every one of those choices was a decision, and decisions compound, not because the universe keeps score, but because people do. Because I did. I filed every one of those moments away, not out of bitterness, but because I was paying attention, and paying attention turned out to be the most valuable skill I ever developed. Harriet used to say that the best accountants aren't the ones who are good at math. They're the ones who notice when something doesn't add up, and have the discipline to follow that thread all the way to the end, even when the end is uncomfortable. I think that's true of life too. I noticed early on that my mother-in-law's warmth never quite reached her eyes. I noticed that my husband's apologies always came with a redirect. I noticed those things and told myself I was misreading them because I wanted something to work out, and wanting something badly enough can temporarily override your own judgment. The miscarriage changed that, not because grief made me wise. Grief mostly just made me exhausted, but because it stripped away everything I'd been using to avoid clarity. When you're sitting on a bathroom floor at 2 a.m, and the thing you were building your future around is gone, there's nothing left to paper over the truth with. The truth was that I had been in a situation where I was slowly disappearing, and the people who should have caught me weren't looking. So I stopped waiting to be caught. That was the turning point, not some dramatic declaration, just a quiet internal shift from waiting to moving. The ethics of what I did that Tuesday in my conference room weren't complicated. I didn't humiliate Sandra. I didn't make her beg. I gave her 2 names of professionals who could actually help her son because that was the right thing to do. What I refused to give her was access to my labor, my reputation, and my professional judgment, as though 9 years of silence had cost nothing and proximity to my success was something she'd earned. It hadn't been. She hadn't. I think real integrity is partly about knowing the difference between generosity and self-erasure, between forgiveness, which I had given quietly and mostly for my own benefit, and obligation, which I owed to no one in that room. Celeste Harmon built a business on finding what was hidden inside other people's numbers. What I found, eventually, inside my own story, was that the people who tell you that you don't fit are usually measuring you against a space they designed specifically to exclude you. The answer was never to fit better. The answer was to build a room of my own and decide who got invited in. Carter is 9 now. Last week he told me that anglerfish produce their own light in complete darkness. He said it like it was the most matter-of-fact thing in the world. I wrote it down. I think about that a lot.